All right, so we've got a fascinating deep dive for you all today, a real head scratcher.
Oh, definitely. This one has really got people talking.
It's about Alzheimer's, right?
Yep, but with a twist, like a real big twist.
Right. Usually we think about, older folks when we think about Alzheimer's, right?
Exactly, exactly. Late 60s, 70s, 80s. That's kind of the territory we're used to, right?
But this case, it involves a teenager.
A teenager, yeah, 19 years old,
Yeah.
diagnosed with Alzheimer's,
19. Wow. That's unheard of, right?
practically. It's incredibly rare, and it throws a real wrench in what we thought we knew about Alzheimer's, to be honest.
So, what's going on here? I mean, how does this even happen?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? Before we get into this specific case, though, I think it's worth doing a quick refresh on Alzheimer's in general, just so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, okay, good idea.
So Alzheimer's disease, it's a neurodegenerative disease, meaning it affects the brain, causes it to, well, degenerate.
Yeah.
It's the most common cause of dementia, which is basically um, a decline in thinking skills that affects everyday life.
Right, like memory loss, difficulty thinking, problems with language,
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
Exactly. And as the disease progresses, it gets harder and harder for people to remember things, to learn new information, to think clearly. They might have trouble with their mood and behavior too.
It can be really tough on the person with Alzheimer's and their loved ones.
Absolutely. It's a heartbreaking disease. Now,
Right.
as you said, it typically affects older adults. That's what we call late onset Alzheimer's.
But then there's this thing called early onset, right?
Right. Early onset is when someone develops symptoms before age 65, sometimes even in their 40s or 50s. It's much less common than the late onset variety, but it can be even more aggressive.
So more aggressive, meaning it progresses more quickly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like instead of a slow decline, it's more like falling off a cliff, cognitively speaking.
And this early onset, any idea what causes it? Is it the same as with older folks?
Well, with early onset, genetics often play a bigger role. Researchers have identified specific genes like PSAN1, PSAN2, and APP that can directly cause early onset Alzheimer's if you inherit a faulty copy from a parent.
Oh, wow. So it can run in families.
Yeah, it can. And when it does, it's often called familial Alzheimer's disease. But even with early onset, the majority of cases don't have a clear-cut genetic cause.
Okay, so then we get to this 19-year-old, right? He's got Alzheimer's, which already seems crazy young, but to make it even more unusual.
They couldn't find any of those typical genetic mutations. They tested him, and he didn't have any of the known genetic markers.
Really? So not even the early onset genes?
Nope, none. And get this, he had no family history of Alzheimer's either. It was a total mystery.
Okay, now that is really strange. So what else could it be?
Right, so they started looking for other explanations, right? Things like infections, maybe some kind of head injury he had earlier in life, anything that could potentially explain this really early cognitive decline.
Because sometimes those things can mimic dementia symptoms, can't they?
They can, absolutely. But they ruled all that out. No infections, no history of head trauma, nothing.
So it's not genetics, it's not an injury, it's not some kind of infection. What's left?
That's the question that's got everyone baffled. But here's the thing. It wasn't like it hit him overnight. His problem started a few years earlier, around age 17.
Oh, really? What were his early symptoms like?
Well, at first, he was having trouble concentrating, difficulty reading, and then he started forgetting recent events, misplacing things, classic Alzheimer's symptoms, but in a teenager.
That's so young to be experiencing those kinds of problems. It must have been really scary for him and his family.
Absolutely. He ended up having to drop out of high school because his memory and thinking were so impaired.
Did they do those memory tests, the ones they often use to diagnose Alzheimer's?
They did. And the results were startling. His scores were way lower than they should have been for someone his age, much lower. This wasn't just a case of senior moments.
That's just heartbreaking. It really makes you wonder what's going on inside his brain that's causing all of this.
That's exactly what scientists are trying to figure out. See, most research points to these things called amyloid plaques and tau tangles as the culprits in Alzheimer's.
I think I've heard of those, but remind me what they are.
Sure. So basically, they're these abnormal protein clumps that build up in the brain, kind of like, think of it like gunk clogging up a drain. Amyloid plaques, they form outside and around brain cells, while tau tangles form inside the cells.
And those clumps, they mess with how the brain works.
Exactly. They disrupt communication between brain cells, eventually causing them to die off. And this damage, it spreads through the brain, leading to the memory loss and cognitive decline we see in Alzheimer's.
Okay, so that's the usual explanation for Alzheimer's. But this young man, he doesn't have the genes usually linked to those protein clumps, right?
Right, exactly. And that's what's got researchers scratching their heads.
Yeah.
Because if it's not genetics causing those plaques and tangles, what is it? Could there be another pathway, something we haven't discovered yet, that's triggering them?
And if there is, does that mean there are more people out there, maybe even young people, who are developing Alzheimer's without us realizing it?
That's the big question. I mean, it's possible this case is just a one-off, a total anomaly. But it's also possible it's the tip of the iceberg.
That's a scary thought, but it makes sense. If this can happen without the usual genetic risks, it kind of changes how we think about Alzheimer's.
It really does.
Mm.
This case, as tragic as it is, could revolutionize our understanding of this disease. It highlights the need for more research into non-genetic triggers of Alzheimer's, things like environmental toxins, maybe even certain viruses.
Yeah, and we need to get better at recognizing the early signs, especially in younger people who might not fit the typical profile for Alzheimer's.
Absolutely. Early diagnosis is crucial because the sooner we can intervene, the better chance we have of slowing down the progression of the disease.
This case, while heartbreaking, really highlights how much we still don't know about Alzheimer's.
Absolutely. But it also offers a glimmer of hope. Because by studying cases like this, by delving into the unknowns, we might uncover new avenues for treatment and prevention. And who knows, this 19-year-old, his case could hold the key to unlocking a cure for Alzheimer's altogether.
Now, that's a thought. So for our listeners out there, here's something to chew on. If this case really does represent a new form of Alzheimer's, one that can affect young people without any family history, what does this mean for how we view cognitive decline, even in younger generations? Is it possible that what we thought we knew about Alzheimer's needs a complete overhaul? It's something to think about.